and this is a screencast for my AP Biology students from chapters 54 and 56 in the Ecology Unit in the Pearson AP Biology book. So hopefully this will be helpful for you. So my students watch a documentary called the Serengeti Rules. It's a book by Sean Carroll. It is absolutely fantastic. If you haven't read it yet, you should. And next best case is to watch the documentary called Serengeti Rules. But basically, it is an outline of the history of some groundbreaking ecologists that figured out that not all species are equal, and that we have these species that are called keystone species that really determine the quality of the environment and affect the population size of lots of other species in that ecosystem. And so I really hope that you will watch that video. It really is very, very helpful in understanding this concept. So one of the things that we know that there is a difference between dominant and keystone species. So a dominant species in an ecosystem could be the most populous organisms, or it could be the most biomass, all right, like a particular type of tree might be a dominant species if you were looking at biomass. But a keystone species, as I said before, is going to be a pivotally important species in that ecosystem that is going to affect the population sizes of other populations of organisms and the quality of that environment. So they have an importance for the whole ecosystem that is much greater than one would think. So a niche, right? So you guys know a niche is basically the role that an organism plays in that particular ecosystem. And there is a difference between the fundamental niche and a realized niche. So a fundamental niche, you can think of it as like hypothetically, where could that organism live? Where could it have its role in that ecosystem? The realized niche is the niche that it actually has. And this could be because of a competitor, it could be because of a certain predator, and sometimes if you remove those competitors or predators, then you could see the realized niche expanding into more of the fundamental niche. So the textbook gives an example of a particular type of barnacle that can live both in the deep and the shallow intertidal zones, and that the competition from another type of barnacle actually forces the original species of barnacles into a higher, drier zone from the competition of that other organism. So that's a great example to have in your hip pocket of a difference between a realized and a fundamental niche. The other things that organisms do is they sometimes do something called niche or resource partitioning, right? So over here I have an example of these similar types of warblers that evolved to feeding off of different portions of the tree. Why? Because it would decrease competition, right? And some large prey specialists are going to target different kinds of organisms, some big carnivores, to again partition the resources so that they can have kind of organization more for everyone, and that ends up being able to maximize the number of organisms that can be successful in that particular habitat. So character displacement. Let's for example look at the typical example, the finch beaks. Okay, so there are some organisms that are allopatrically separated. Allo means other, patric means country. So these are two organisms that are separated geographically, like by a river or the Grand Canyon or something like that. Sympatric organisms are geographically overlapped. There's something else that makes them a little bit different, but they are in the same geographical area. And so there is a tendency for characters or characteristics, in this case the beak of the finch, to diverge more in sympatric rather than allopatric populations because of the competition. And so we can see that in these are islands in the Galapagos Islands, that we can see that when these two different species of finches are forced to live in the same islands, that their character displacement, in other words, the shape and size of their beak, changes more than if they had their own habitat, if they were allopatrically separated. So there are two different theories that explain or attempt to explain how ecosystem populations change over time. And one of them is the bottom-up theory, and one of them is the top-down theory. So I'm going to go over those very quickly. So in a bottom-up control, you would focus on the bottom of the trophic levels, right? So the producers. So for example, all the other trophic levels are going to be dependent on the producers. So for example, if you affected the amount of biomass that's produced during photosynthesis by not giving any fertilizer, that would mean less snails, less frogs, and then less foxes in that particular food chain, because they're all dependent either directly or indirectly on the producers' productivity in photosynthesis. So that's an example of bottom-up control. But we also know that we have top-down or oscillating control. So for example, if we look at the top of the energy pyramid and we look at our predators here, like the foxes, if we were to decrease the population of foxes, well, that's going to be a heyday for the frogs, right? The frog population is going to go way up. But then that is going to affect the population of snails, because if there's more frogs, then you would have less snails. Well, if you have less snails, then you would have more plants, right? So you have a top-down control. A hallmark of that is that you have this oscillating or kind of alternating cascade effects. So both of these controls, top-down and bottom-up, can be used to control population sizes. And we are learning this especially in more and more ecosystems that are so dominated by humans, and where humans are going in and trying to kind of fix the scales. We know that we can use both bottom-up and top-down controls to be able to maximize and rehabilitate populations that have been damaged or destroyed by human actions. So, range of tolerance, what does that mean? Well, we're going to talk about that when we talk about stream study, organisms, and our macroinvertebrates, and how much oxygen dissolved in the water they can use. Temperature is another one. And so you have a range of temperature here for these steelhead trouts, and you have a tolerance where they are in physiological stress, so they don't like it, but they can live with it, or too hot or too cold, where they're just not there because they're intolerant of that particular temperature. And then you have an optimal zone. And most organisms are going to have ranges of tolerances for different living abiotic and biotic factors that are in their environment. Batesian versus Malarian mimicry. So this is always a hard one to remember. But Batesian mimicry is where you have some harmless or palatable species. So palatable means that it tastes good to be eaten, that mimics an unpalatable or harmful species, right? And you can definitely see the strategy for that harmless or palatable species looking like another species that is harmful or unpalatable. So a classic example would be the coral snake, which is poisonous, and you can see this this particular species of milk snake that mimics the coral snake, but it is not poisonous. We have another type of mimicry called malarian, and in malarian you have two or more organisms that are unpalatable and not harmful resemble each other to try to make the predators learn faster, right? So yellow and black are colors that are frequently used in nature to do this. And obviously, if I am a butterfly, I really don't want anybody to eat me. I would rather have people not eat me. And so organisms can evolve certain unpalatable, alkaline, bitter tasting things so they won't be eaten. Or they can use this mimicry to try to increase their chances of survival. So we have competition with organisms, and we have interspecies competition and intraspecies. So the way to remember this prefix is think of an international airport flying between countries. So over here, I have an example of interspecies, right? So here are looks like some warthogs and some type of antelope that are all in competition, in this case for water. We also have in this picture some intraspecies competition. So here I've got the roots of two particular types, same type of trees that are competing for water absorption through their roots and nutrient absorption. So we have two different types of competition. We also have 5 major types of symbiotic relationships. So we have predation, we have parasitism, competition, mutualism, and commensalism. All right, so you should review these. I know you all learned these before. I like to think of this as a plus minus. Sometimes it is shown like that in books. So predation is definitely a plus minus, right? The predator is the plus and the prey is the minus. Parasitism is also a plus minus. So the parasite is the plus and the host is the minus, right? Competition is usually a plus minus, although sometimes competitions can end up being okay for both species. Mutualism is a plus plus, right? So it is a relationship where these organisms have a benefit for both of the organisms that are in the mutualistic symbiotic relationship. And commensalism sometimes is kind of hard to find because the more we look at these, sometimes we realize it's mutualism and not commensalism. So anyway, the commensalism is where one benefits and the other is not harmed or benefit. I want to take just a minute to talk about parasitism. It's so interesting. I wish we had more time to talk about this. But there's lots of different types of parasites. There are ectoparasites like ticks and endoparasites like tapeworm, intracellular parasites like a malarial parasite. Social parasites like a cowbird that actually will go in and lay its egg in other birds' nest to kind of be a freeloader. And then we have hyperparasites, which are sometimes parasites on a parasite. And one of the things that's really interesting about this symbiotic relationship is that parasites can actually manipulate their hosts. And a great example of this is a flatworm parasite called Leucochloridium. And it is, flatworms are also called platyhelminthes. A lot of these are parasites. They're very simple organisms. And in this case, this particular parasite's host is a snail. And the parasite manipulates the snail's mind and its body to make it more likely to be eaten by birds, because that's good for the parasite because it spreads the parasite. And it is just fascinating how this works. So I have a real quick video to show you that.
Under this layer of vegetation, a shade-loving snail has been invaded by worms. These parasites take over the snail's brain and push into his tentacles, transforming them into swollen, colorful, pulsating targets. At dawn, the snail leaves the protection of the vegetation, climbing toward danger. Out in the open, in the hot and dry sun, the snail is exposed and vulnerable. The pulsating tentacles mimic a maggot, the perfect meal for the parasite's next host. A bird. The snail will likely survive this attack, but more parasites are growing inside its body and will move into its regenerated tentacles. The worms are ingested by the bird and begin to reproduce. The bird spreads thousands of parasite eggs throughout the forest to infect more snails.
So I just think that's fascinating because not only is the parasite manipulating the body of the snail, but it's also affecting the behavior, right? Snails don't like to go way up high in a plant. Obviously, they like cool, moist, and they want to stay away from predators. So it's actually kind of mind control that this parasite's doing. Really fascinating. Another terms that we need to be able to differentiate are detrivores versus decomposers. So a detrivore would be like beetles, vultures, anything that eats dead material. And the detrivores are consuming dead material. They help to kind of disseminate the dead material's body, but they are not recycling the nutrients. That's what decomposers do. Okay, so decomposers are bacteria and fungi. So here I've got some toadstools on a dead tree, and when they're done with the material, it has been recycled back to the basic elements, and the decomposer's job is to do that. So they're breaking down the dead material back into the organic matter and the nutrients that then get in the soil or the water, and that recycles those nutrients. So another term that's important, latitudinal gradient and species richness. So easy to remember this one. We have a higher species diversity around the equator, which decreases to lower diversity toward the poles. And that has to do with the intensity of the sun at the equator, the levels of photosynthesis. You can produce a lot more plant matter, and that's the basis of the food chains. We also have high rainfall, usually at those latitudes as well, and so that makes sense that we would have more species diversity at the equator and decreasing as we go towards the poles. Another interesting topic is island biogeographical models. So basically what this is, an area of ecology that is looking at islands. So islands, and especially this would be like new islands that are made from volcanic eruptions. So there are mathematical models that explain this, and for my class, we do not have to know these mathematical models, but I just want to basically give you the premise of this. So here I have some chains of islands that are in the Pacific Ocean, and I can see that if I look at the size of the island versus the number of species, the larger islands have a greater number of species. Makes sense, right? Because they have more habitat there. The islands that are closest to the mainland also have a greater number of species, right? So disseminating those further and further away would limit the number of the diversity of organisms on that island. So we end up with this equilibrium model. So we have emigration, which is the number of species that are coming in from the mainland, and then we have extinction of the species that are on the island, right? You get too many new things coming in, and you're going to have more of an extinction rate. And so based on this mathematical model, you have an equilibrium number, you have a balance of those two forces that you can actually predict. And you can predict whether it's going to be on a small island or a large island. And this is a very powerful tool for ecologists. The other thing that we can look at is biodiversity hotspots. So we know that there are areas where we have lots of biodiversity, but we also have a greater impact of human actions that are limiting and affecting the populations and the species richness in those areas. And a lot of this has to do with what we call the extinction vortex. So my students have watched a video that I made on the extinction vortex, but basically just to show you again that you have these different forces that are going to decrease a population and fragment it. And then you have less genetic diversity because you have more inbreeding, so you have less genetic variability at your disposal, and that makes the population more vulnerable because they don't have the variability that they would normally have to deal with the stresses in the environment, and that reduces the population number, and then you just have this spiral. So ecologists can use the extinction vortex, and they can use areas where we have biodiversity hotspots and be able to help ecosystems come back from that. There is a minimal viable population. So this would be the number of organisms that are stable. It would be the smallest number of organisms, minimum, that would be stable. And when you're trying to manage a population, you would need to know that as an ecologist to be able to, because you want your populations to be stable, otherwise they're going to go extinct. So one of the things that humans have done is that even though we've altered the environment, like putting in a freeway you can see over here, we have tried to create movement corridors for organisms. So, for example, animals that are herd animals that migrate. All right, if you have some kind of artificial barrier like a interstate highway, they're not going to be able to complete their migration. And so, more places have produced these movement corridors where animals that are, say, predators that have a big range and they need to move, or herd animals can use. And also learning more about ecology and setting up these urban ecological islands where we can maintain some species diversity even in an urban setting. Coevolution is an important term to know. Here, the classic examples are certain kinds of plants and the organisms that pollinate them, and the mutual symbiotic relationship between them drives this type of evolution, where they are they have evolved lockstep with each other, and they have a special relationship that you can see in the characteristics that they both have. Sustainability. This is an important topic today, right? So, and this is an important buzzword whether you are in business or whether you're in science. So something being sustainable. So we need growth, we need economic development, social development, and we need environmental protection, because if we use up our natural resources, we're not going to have them. That's a dead end, right? And so we need to focus on sustainable development. So examples of that would be replanting trees after we cut them down, limiting the number of fish in a catch to make sure there's enough left behind. Think about minimum viable population. So we live near the Chesapeake Bay, and they're going to have limited number of crabs that you can catch and limited number of oysters to try to make the sustainable population growths of those two important species. And just literally protecting areas and habitats, like in the rainforest, that you would carve out an area and say, we're not going to develop this because we need to protect these areas to have positive benefits for humans, like, for example, new medicines from plants, and also that we can get new medicines and treatments from animals. Disturbances. So these are definitely in the news these days, right? Like our examples would be forest fires, which could be man-made or natural, war, which is definitely man-made, oil spills, which are also man-made. So disturbances are things in ecosystems that would disrupt any kind of populations that are living in them. And you might think disturbances are all bad. Usually the man-made ones are, but the disturbances that are natural disturbances, like forest fires, for example, in certain areas where there are lots of conifers or pine trees, those have been shown to actually benefit the environment over a long period of time. Same thing with prairie fires that would be started, before humans were ever around, by lightning. They actually help to keep the prairie absent of trees, which helps to keep that habitat going, that particular type of specialized ecosystem. So sometimes disturbances can be bad and sometimes they can be natural. There is the intermediate hypothesis theory that basically says that the species diversity in a certain area is maximized when the disturbances don't happen too often or too rarely. So there's kind of that sweet spot, and this would definitely be natural disturbances, not human disturbances, that would actually help the population. So I want to finish up today talking about eutrophication. This is a really important topic, and this is another one that humans have definitely messed up. So the process of eutrophication, where you have a lake that slowly begins to fill in with sediment over centuries, then you would get a wetland, and eventually you would get a grassland, and then you would eventually get a forest, right? So you've learned about these. That's natural eutrophication. Humans, though, cultural eutrophication speeds up the process of natural eutrophication, and there are some very detrimental effects of that I want to talk about. The problem in cultural eutrophication is too much nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the nutrients that phytoplankton, algae, need in aquatic systems. And so when these nutrients get into the aquatic system, the algae go crazy. They start to reproduce, and what happens is that you can get something called an algal bloom. And you might think, well, that's a good thing. They're producing oxygen, they're producing biomass. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that they grow so much so fast that they actually start to block out the sun. And then the algae that live underneath that start to die. And that decaying matter starts to accumulate down at the bottom of my aquatic habitat where my decomposers are, right? My decomposers are down there. Well, my decomposers are going to go crazy because they have this decomposing matter, so they have lots of food source. And here's the ticket, guys. Decomposers utilize oxygen. So as the population of the decomposers, the bacteria and the fungi increase to eat this dead stuff, the oxygen layer plummets in the water. And so that sucks the oxygen away from all the other organisms, and you end up having a situation where you have very low oxygen that affects all of the creatures in my aquatic system. The other thing that can also mimic that is just plain sediment, right? So muddy sediment that runs off from the land can also block the sunlight, which also has the same effect as the algal bloom in that you end up with dying algae going to the bottom, decomposers having a feast, their population increase, and my dissolved oxygen levels plummet. So think about all the different places in a modern human environment that are going to affect these. So our septic tanks, our sewer systems, right? And especially when we have any kind of flooding, sometimes these will run off and get into our rivers and our creeks, which eventually get into our estuaries and into our oceans. Agriculture. You think about animal poop running off; those are nutrients free. You think full of nutrients. You think of any type of fertilizers, right? That we use to grow the food that we eat. If those aren't carefully applied, they can run off. Think about golf courses. Think about your lawn, right? When you put that stuff down on your lawn and then it rains, well, it runs off, gets into the water table, and ends up causing this increase of nutrients, which cause algal blooms that look like this, or look like this, or look like this, right? And so I can see that my dissolved oxygen is going to plummet. I have more sediment that is occurring for the dead bodies. Now I have less nutrient exchange, and so my system starts to break down, and I end up with a very unhealthy aquatic system. So if we have two terms that you need to know, we have low dissolved oxygen, which is called a hypoxic environment, or we can have actually no dissolved oxygen in extreme cases that we would call an anoxic environment. And sometimes we call these dead zones. So, for example, dead zones form at the mouth of the Mississippi River. So here you can recognize this is Louisiana. The mouth of the Mississippi River, think about all the nutrients that it is carrying through all the farmlands and all the population centers that are that get into the river and end up in the Gulf of Mexico. And so what happens is that these areas are either hypoxic or anoxic zones where there's literally nothing alive because the oxygen is so depleted. In the Chesapeake Bay, which is near where we live, we also have anoxic and hypoxic conditions, especially because the Chesapeake Bay is very narrow and very shallow, and it is also near very high population centers. So think about this when you think about the health of the streams in your own area. Think about things like riparian buffers, which are just corridors of living vegetation that is on either side of a stream, because that prevents sediment from getting in. And we just saw that sediment in itself can block the sun and also cause this as well. The other thing is that this is always worse. The dead zones always increase in the summer or with warm water. And if you haven't yet in AP Biology done the dissolved oxygen lab, you'll know why. There is a relationship between warm water and cooler water and how much oxygen can be dissolved in the warmer water versus the cooler water. So that's really important. Think too about climate change. Think about warmer oceans, warmer rivers, warmer lakes, and what effects that is going to have as well. So hopefully this has been helpful for you, and I will see you in class. And